I'm pleased to have with me in studio this morning Professor Christopher Lind. Christopher is a senior fellow of Massey College at the University of Toronto. From 2003 to 2006, he served as the director of the Toronto School of Theology, also at the University of Toronto. And from 1985 until 2003, he was in Saskatoon, where he worked first as a professor of church and society, and then as the president of St. Andrew's Theological College. He earned his Master of Divinity degree from Trinity College and completed a PhD in theology at the University of St. Michael's College, where he specialized in ethics and economics. He has authored or co-edited 5 books in the areas of ecumenical social ethics, globalization and agriculture, and mission and theology. Good morning, Professor Lind.
Good morning.
So my first question. This past November, you gave a presentation to the Niagara Synod of the Anglican Church, in which you identified a tension between advocates of social justice and advocates of environmental justice. What is this tension between the two groups, and is it misguided?
Well, first of all, the tension's been going on for a long time, but it's certainly current today, and you heard it in the headlines that were just read relating to the development of the tar sands in Alberta. So, on the one hand, you have people who say that the way you overcome poverty is through economic development, and developing the tar sands is a form of economic development. On the other hand, you have advocates of ecological justice who say that the development of the tar sands is a rape of the earth. It's a poor use of our limited water resources. It produces enormous greenhouse gases, and so on and so on. So you have these two bodies, both of which are in some ways concerned about justice, but one promoting economic development in order to achieve wealth, in order to address social justice, and the other wanting to limit industrial development in order to achieve justice with regard to the environment. So these appear to be in conflict. It's misguided because social justice is concerned not only for people of today but also for people of tomorrow. And so if we are increasing greenhouse gases, and if the increase in greenhouse gases ends up producing a crisis for the people of tomorrow and for the rest of creation, then we've just put off the crisis from today until tomorrow. So that's a false choice. So that's why it's a tension that we need to resolve with a different kind of strategy in order to achieve justice for creation and to achieve justice for human populations is the same effort.
Okay. So that leads to my next question. What then is ecojustice, and how would you define some of its basic ethical norms and principles?
So ecojustice is a term that came into our vocabulary about 1970. If about what was going on in the West in the 1960s, you had in the United States Lyndon Johnson and his campaign for a Great Society, which was in part an anti-poverty initiative. You had Trudeau coming along with his campaign for the Just Society, which included a campaign against poverty. You had inquiries with regard to Senator David Kroll, for example, leading the Senate inquiry about poverty with seniors. So you had a lot of concern for social justice in the 60s. At the same time, you had the emerging concern for pollution. You had Rachel Carson and her book on called Silent Spring, and the concern for pesticide use. And you had for the first time, really, a concern for the carrying capacity of the earth. So people being concerned about massive increases in population and the resource depletion that population increase represented. In 1970 or 71, you have the Club of Rome producing its book on the limits to growth, as an example. Many people thought that was crazy. Now it seems quite straightforward, that kind of approach. So you had these conflicting approaches, and in the churches, you had both approaches being represented, although the concern for social justice was much stronger than the concern for environmental justice. In the United States, some people started to say this is a false dichotomy. We need to overcome this division, and started to use the word. In fact, it was an American Baptist who started to use the word ecojustice to describe an approach which was inclusive of social justice and environmental justice. This was not merely a religious approach. It certainly had impact in the World Council of Churches, with its theme on justice, peace, and the integrity of creation. But it also had an impact in the secular society through the United Nations, and the concern for sustainability. And eventually the United Nations created the International Commission on Development, chaired by Gro Harlem Brundtland. They produced the Brundtland Report in 1987, which defined sustainability in relation to a concern for sustainability not only in the present but also in the future. Out of that UN Commission on Development, you then had the Rio Conference in 1992, and while the Rio Conference was significant for what it accomplished, it's also significant for what was not accomplished. There was a proposed Charter of Earth Rights that was presented at that conference, but there weren't enough signatories to get it signed. And several years later, I think it was 1994, that process was restarted by the Canadian Maurice Strong, who chaired the Rio Conference, and the former Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. So they ended up producing what's called the Earth Charter. And the Earth Charter elaborates the norms of ecojustice. Now, you can remember the norms of ecojustice by the 4 S's. The 4 S's are solidarity, sustainability, sufficiency, and socially just participation in decision-making. So these are ethical norms, and then these norms, some people add equity to those 4 S's. Those 4 norms are elaborated in much more detail in the Earth Charter.
I was struck. I reviewed the Earth Charter, and it's explicitly doesn't just refer to the environment. As you're saying, it talks about gender equality and equity. It talks about universal access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunity. Focus on human dignity, bodily health, and spiritual well-being.
Right.
Special attention to minorities and Aboriginal people. Right. Talking about strengthening of democratic institutions, right. Inclusive participation in decision-making, and finally, it works towards its final principle: promote culture of tolerance, nonviolence, and peace. And I thought that was significant.
Right. So if you just hear the word Earth Charter, you might think, well, this is just about environmental issues without a reference to the issues of social equity. But you read it in detail and you discover it's a lot about human interaction as well as interactions between humans and the rest of creation.
I know you've touched on it. Is there any way you could maybe elaborate on that connection between social justice and the environment? For instance, in 2003, the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops issued the statement, "The cry of the earth and the cry of the poor are one." I know it's important in terms of considering our future, but in terms of environmental justice having an impact on the poor of the present.
Well, let's use some practical examples. If we think about global climate change and greenhouse gases, then if we think about the conferences we've just had in Bali, then what you've got is industrial production producing greenhouse gases. The greenhouse gases is affecting the whole world, but it's affecting the whole world in a way that affects the most vulnerable first. So the poorest people live in the most vulnerable regions of the world. Their purchase on the land is precarious. They live on low-lying islands. They live in river deltas. You look at New Orleans. The richest houses were the houses highest up. The poorest houses were the ones that got flooded first with Katrina. So the people with the fewest resources are the least able to protect themselves from environmental damage and global climate change. So that's why the pursuit of environmental justice is also a pursuit for social justice.
Okay. So then if we turn to maybe some more explicit Christian sources, if we consider God's injunction in Genesis to humans to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth, can Scripture be a resource for an environmentally friendly ethic? And you do mention in one of your articles the Earth Bible Project.
Right. It's interesting that people will often quote that passage from Genesis as if that's the only passage that relates to God's relationship to creation. Genesis is the first book of the Bible, but it's not the first book written about the Bible in the Bible. And there are many places in the Bible that talk about God's relationship with creation. Even in Genesis itself, there is a second story of the Garden of Eden, which calls on human beings to till it and keep it. Thinking of the Garden of Eden as an actual garden, which represents a different kind of relationship. Norman Habel is a biblical scholar, Old Testament scholar, Hebrew Bible scholar, in Adelaide at Flinders University, and he started a project that you named called the Earth Bible Project. They've produced 5 volumes of essays by scholars around the world, and what they did was they developed a set of ecojustice principles. And these are not ethical principles. They are hermeneutical principles. So these are principles for interpreting Scripture. So, for example, the first principle is the universe, the earth, and all its components have intrinsic worth or value. The second principle is earth is a community of interconnected living things that are mutually dependent on each other for life and survival. The third principle is earth is a subject capable of raising its voice in celebration and against injustice. Those are 3 of the principles. So all of these authors took those principles and reread Scripture in light of these principles to see whether there was evidence to support these principles or not. So one of the things we learn in interpreting all texts, including sacred texts, is that all of us come to the text with certain assumptions. And it's these assumptions that are addressed by the question of hermeneutical principles. So what assumptions are we going to apply? So are we going to start with the assumption that the earth and humanity are separate? Or are we going to start with the assumption that the earth and humanity are one? And depending on what attitude you have, it'll change the way you interpret Scripture.
Okay. Well, one of these principles I notice focuses on a metaphor for understanding the relationship between human beings and the environment. And recognizing that biblical injunction to dominate and subdue, many have turned to the metaphor of stewardship or husbandry, that human beings should be stewards of creation in God's absence. How is this language of husbandry, of stewardship, problematic, and what pattern of social relationship can furnish us with a more adequate norm or ideal for human community with the land?
Right. So what you're raising is the issue of patriarchy and how patriarchy affects our understanding of Scripture. So when you talk about husbanding the land, what associations do you have with the word husband? Do you have patriarchal assumptions about husband, or do you have egalitarian attitudes about the word husband? The same with the word steward. For a long time, we've been interpreting the word steward as being ethically neutral, if not beneficial. But the steward is basically a senior slave in the household of a very large landowner. And if the very large landowner is an exploitative person, perpetuating images of injustice, then the image of steward is actually an image of unjust relationship. It's actually an image of exploitation. So what the advocates of the Earth Bible use as an alternative rendering of this term is the term mutual custodianship. First of all, you have the concept of mutuality, and then you have the idea of having custody of something. It doesn't belong to you, but you care for it on behalf of someone else. What's challenging for some of us is the idea of mutuality. I mean, yes, we care for the earth, but in what way does the earth care for us? So, I mean, all of the air that we breathe is also the same air that all of the animals breathe. In what way are the animals caring for us? In what way are the trees caring for us by taking in the carbon dioxide and producing oxygen?
Okay, well, thanks so much for joining us, Professor Lind. We've been speaking with Professor Christopher Lind, a theologian, ethicist, teacher, writer,